First of all, good evening, welcome. This is the second of our panel discussions, inspired by the topics and themes which Madame Butterfly and indeed other operas, but specifically Madame Butterfly, seem to provoke these days. And we thought, in the past, often we asked the director to sort of pile all sorts of meaning and interpretations into their one go at the opera. And we're actually taking a different approach from this. We actually felt that the best way to really show consideration for these themes is actually to have frank and open discussions about them. So this is one of four discussions. We had one a couple of days ago about modern day slavery, and we are recording those, so they will become available on the YouTube channel once we've just edited them down. So all these being recorded, so one can look at them a bit later on. But the subject of tonight is about reimagining. How do we address, how do we reconsider these pieces which to certain segments of our audience or our potential audience now cause problems, which may be mystifying to us in the opera profession. So I'm really delighted to be, let me introduce my guests, all of whom I know well. So first of all, Lindy Hume. Lindy Hume is our director of Madame Butterfly and has taken time out to, in between, well, your lighting rehearsal starting at when, 7 or so? Now, yes, well, they'll lighten you by an hour. Okay. So we're in mid-rehearsal. We got a run through, or piano stage run through tomorrow, then the orchestra join, and we open, of course, next Friday. I think known to a lot of you will be Michael McCarthy. Michael is, of course, the artistic director of Music Theatre Wales. Michael and I were at university together, so we go back a very long way. Great, fabulous to have you along. And someone who I sort of got to know later on, Michael Williams, who is now the executive director of Buxton International Festival, where Michael, you were one of the first people I popped into when I arrived in the UK, actually, shortly afterwards. And Michael was for many years managing director of Cape Town Opera. So we thought it would be really interesting to have a perspective of someone who has run an opera company in a multiracial community. So inspired by seeing you, Michael, my teaser question to get things going is looking back to the apartheid days, there was, of course, the boycotting of sports events by, be it cricket or rugby or whatever, always under the line that the defense for why people should go was that sport and politics don't mix, and sport and politics are sort of independent. So I guess my question is, as a sort of provocative opener, is do art and politics mix?
Very much so.
Do they live in a different sphere?
Very much so. I think art and politics are embraced in what could be a toxic embrace, but also could be a life-affirming embrace. And I think it's in South Africa was particularly the case. I mean, I recall in '91, Nelson Mandela had recently been released from prison, and the move towards the eventual succession of him as president in '94 was on its way. And we mounted, Lindy, a production. Angelo Gabato mounted a production of Madame Butterfly in '91 in Cape Town. And of course, with our company, which by that stage was already, I would say, 80% of Xhosas and Sothos and Tswanas from across South Africa, a very few of the original Cape Arts Council course was there, were then donned in the traditional production of Madame Butterfly with a wonderful Japanese artist playing the main role. And we thought we would, very clever to have cast a Japanese singer to play Madame Butterfly, and our company would do it. And so we cast the company of young black singers, and the press went mad. We had 3-star. How can you have Madame Butterfly have black cousins and a black uncle? This is ridiculous. This is crazy. And also, they're all made up as white geisha women. How can you have black singers made up with, well, because the geishas used particular makeup, which is not necessarily yellow facing. It's part of the notion of, but they're black. How can you do it? And in Cape Town, Aidan, I have to say, there was a polemic that raged for no less than 2.5 weeks in papers, on news channels. And Angelo's standpoint was very clear, which was, There is truth in what Puccini has written, and that truth resides in the music, and it's important that the singers speak and access that truth. And we will continue to do colorblind casting as a company, and that is the way it continued. And after that polemic, where there was lots, it was on the front pages of the Cape Times at one point. After that moment, where in a sense the ulcer was speared, the audience just took to every single casting decision that was made. Suddenly there was no comments about it. Everybody just enjoyed the voices, and suddenly it became very acceptable to have a multiracial cast, even if they were brothers and sisters of different color, fathers and parents. It was of no concern. And I think that's a lesson for all of us to know, is that we as opera companies need to take that bullet, need to make that stand, and our audience are going to follow. You maintain that incredible reputation with Cape Town Opera throughout your time as an extraordinary exemplar to us all, actually, of how things can be done. But I do have to say, though, Aidan, that when we did Showboat, we had the decision to make, okay, hang on a moment, there's the N word in Showboat, which was used quite a lot, and we went to Germany with it for the first time, and the N word still existed in the show. And then we were going to do a tour of the UK, and I just said, guys, we've got to make changes here. I know this is a sacred text, but this is so inappropriate. And yeah, in Germany we got away with it, but I don't think we're going to get away with it in England. And so then we made changes to the text, Aidan. And we just said that's got to go. The character is clearly racist. We don't need the N word in this instance. It's going to upset our audiences. And then we cut it.
Yeah. But it didn't upset your audience in Cape Town?
Interestingly, no, because the audience by that stage had sort of understood that it was racist and it wasn't an issue. But I think the N-word in Europe and in America and England was far more progressed as a kind of a knee-jerk reaction, something that was very potent, and less so in South Africa at the stage, because we have rather pejorative terms like coloured, which are used quite a lot in positive and negative ways. So it wasn't that big an issue, but I'm so pleased we did, because in England we would have been crucified for that.
Well, in many ways, the issues you were facing way back in Cape Town are probably only recently coming to us as areas of our communities who we'd really love to bring into the opera. Have problems with the art form, and especially certain works. Lindy, I really introduced you to our webinar audience because, as well as being our director of Butterfly, you with great distinction have run 4 major festivals in Australia: the Perth Festival, International Festival, the Sydney Festival, which is a humongously large festival, and now 2, one in Tasmania and one in New South Wales. And one of the marks of that is the way you've worked in collaboration with Indigenous populations. Has that really helped inform your practice, your art?
It really has, because it's a very interesting counterpoint to my work as an opera director. And I feel that directing festivals has got me really much closer to the community than, with all respect, opera companies have ever allowed me to be. And so, one spends a lot more time as a neighbor and as a, living in the communities which one serves, and a lot of the work that we did in Perth, and also certainly the stuff that we're doing at 10 Days on the Island, and actually all the way through, the idea of being in regional communities and exploring what it is to be in part of a local community really has informed the way I think about directing opera too, in a global sense. So when I come to Cardiff, I really want to know about Cardiff and about Wales and what the context is, which is very different to when I'm directing something in Leipzig, for example. So I think the sense of what is this community, and how does the opera the politics of the opera fit into the conversation that the community is having about who it is and what it, what sort of community we want to be. So that's been very interesting in relation to in relation to Madame Butterfly, to be able to bring that sort of, that conversation which you opened, Aidan, with the whole conversation about what kind of Madame Butterfly you wanted for Welsh National Opera. And so that allowed me to use that sort of thinking about, what are we trying to say here about who we are as a community and where opera is in this conversation about all these really important things that, frankly, we're playing catch up with in terms of casting and the politics of the world out beyond the opera landscape.
Michael, you've probably commissioned more new operas than anyone I know, certainly. And, obviously we not only go back a long way, but you were a very regular guest when I was at Buxton in Michael's position now. And we always, valued Music Theatre Wales coming. Do you feel that in more recent times, that as you engage with composers and librettists, you are either expecting or indeed asking for a more, shall we say, socially conscious theme to whatever that you want them to come up with, or do you find that comes naturally now, but as people tune in, or are we in a world still where we have space with new works for works which may exist in a, for want of a better term, an artistic environment?
No, I think we exist in a completely different environment now, and a rapidly changing one. And this is the politics of arts. Lindy was talking about how we play these works in our time to these people. That's a political kind of consideration. Commissioning work is no less political, potentially more so. And I think that there is a history of opera, which we may come to, of expecting certain kinds of artists, and indeed certain kinds of artists expecting to be commissioned to write opera. And one of the things that's absolutely caught my attention now and has evolved over the last 4 or 5 years is thinking about who should be writing opera. So who is opera written by? Who is it written for? As a fundamental consideration. So it moves away from how clever is it? How high art is it? How well crafted? How virtuosic is it? To the critical element, which is, what is it saying? Who is saying it? And who is it for? And I think these are the fundamentals. You asked about politics. We go back to the Greeks. There's nothing more political than Greek theatre. And what I absolutely love in the theatre, in the live act of making theatre and opera, is that it is both universal, political, and personal. And I think it's that incredible combination that you have to balance very, very carefully. So commissioning is becoming, I think, increasingly sensitive. Not that one is treading on tippy toes to be careful about what one says or does, or what the music says, which I think is going to be a really interesting area of conversation about this. Just to cut to the chase, what is cultural appropriation expressed in music? What is that? So where we're heading is looking at who is writing it and making a deliberate choice to invite artists for whom the word opera is anathema to say, do you know what? You can do this. And not only can you do it, you can lead us in a really interesting new way.
Yeah, absolutely. These thoughts, as we in the industry have been around us for 3, 4, 5 years now. And one of the challenges I was thinking is, opera it doesn't exist in a naturalistic, the manner of film and TV. And yet I think our industry sometimes struggles to respond to the challenge, and the excuse it finds is that, these criteria of representation don't apply to opera because first and foremost it's sung and primacy of voice, etc. Can we continue to live with that excuse, or should we really listen very carefully to what we're hearing from a larger section of our audience? Anyone? Yes, Michael, you go.
Okay, you know, you're right. The repertoire is mainly frozen in time, really, and there are a lot of traditionalists who want the programming to remain as is, because this is how the original composers and original writers wanted the work to do. And I think it is our duty, really, of care, if we are going to tackle these historical works frozen in time, we need to take a heater to them, to unfreeze them, number one. And secondly, as Michael said, we need to really write a repertoire, create a repertoire that speaks to our age and our time and our issues, as Puccini and Verdi and the great 19th century composers were doing. And that's a journey that is, it's going to take 50 years to do. And all of us are on that journey. And I mean, the solution to Madame Butterfly, Angelo said, we have to start creating African operas that are going to represent our stories, told by our people, representing our histories. And that, you know, I was very fortunate to be in that way. A period of 10, 15 years, there were 20 operas written in South Africa, all with characters that everybody in South Africa could identify with. And I think that is a journey we have to all take.
I think one of the things that I think when I think about representation, and I think about interpretation and how to democratize that, I think one of the biggest and most obvious things is there should be more women in opera, presenting opera, thinking about opera, thinking
writing
about
opera.
Work, writing them, directing them, designing them, conducting them, because, you know, the audience is 70% women, and it's been, with all respect, gentlemen, the kind of domain very much of, you know, a very small, really elite number of sort of blokes, and we really have to, it's just not just the composers, but across you've all seen the stats, they're appalling. And I think simply by and I'm not just talking about women, I'm talking about just diversifying the people who are the interpreters of these works, not just on stage, but in terms of the creative teams and the kind of thinking around them. And by shifting that, you will invariably shift the sort of response to this extraordinary form, and the fact that it is, you know, it is a more, you know, it is an expansive form. It is a big explosive form that people respond to differently. It doesn't have to be always interpreted. I always get worried when people say, but the music is saying this. And I go, well, saying that to you, but it's not that saying that to me. And so there are lots of ways of looking at this, lots of ways of interpreting this, and we just need to share it around a lot more than we do.
Michael.
So, I'll add to that. Yeah, thank you. And indeed, Lindy, you're absolutely right. There's this male-dominated, white male-dominated area of work that we're all involved in. And indeed, we shouldn't all just be talking about it either. You know, this should be a more diverse panel in a way. And so, you know, let's put that out there, especially if we end up talking about Butterfly. And I'd like to touch on the two things, actually. One that Lindy has said, and also that Michael has said about the music itself and what the truth is, and is the truth there, and you know, how political was Puccini compared to Verdi. You know, I would definitely go towards Puccini being very naively political, whereas Verdi was very distinctly and instinctively and powerfully political. And so with something like Butterfly, I have a profound problem with it. And I think I've always had a profound problem with it, not because of what it has said racially, because I've only started to learn about that, in all honesty, but it's about some degrees of sincerity. And I think I've always rankled in Act One with the degree of sincerity that the music is expressing to me in that extraordinary, what sounds like a love duet, you know? And there's Pinkerton pouring his heart out, feeling like this is beautiful, you know, pull out the hankies, this is great. And it hurt and it hits you. I feel the same. And yet he's just learned that she's a 15-year-old girl. He's clearly and openly admitted that he's there and he wants a bit on the side while he's in Japan before he goes home and marries some grown-up American woman. And he's no better than Gary Glitter, you know, and it's just appalling. So there are things about this that you have to really, really take seriously and carefully, you know, because there is in performing these works, we can very easily upset other people. The word trauma is used an awful lot, and I slightly avoid that, but we can definitely upset people whose stories we are treading all over by doing this. So there's a, you know, where do we go? And I don't know, Aidan, if you want to go there straight away or whether we want to build the picture up a bit more.
No, we'll leave it, because you're right about Puccini. I mean, unlike Verdi, who leaves an area of ambiguity in his music, by the time you get to the very end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you know, the taste for melodrama, for music to absolutely describe or lead the viewer to a certain emotion. I mean, the opera I have most problems with is Tosca. Actually, I have problems with Tosca, and I've directed it twice and still struggle with it, because, you know, there's a sort of fine line between a thriller and a horror movie, and that's about what the director wants the viewer to watch. And I just cannot see Tosca without believing that we're being encouraged into at least a visceral thrill at the suffering, rather than having a sense of detachment and looking at the because of the skill with which Puccini writes. So I think Puccini is particularly difficult here, because he is prescriptive in the way he wants you to respond, and that belongs to its time. That was the taste of its time. So the challenge with Tosca and Butterfly is how to counterbalance that and allow us that element of objectivity. It's difficult.
Definitely, and there's a voyeurism implicit in that. There's you know, that there is a bit of trauma porn in each of these works, and that is so ravishingly, seductively scored by Puccini. I mean, he's a genius, orchestral genius, and you know, there's this kind of pull. But you're right, Michael, the sincerity is the concern. And, you know, if you listen, it's not just what you're hearing orally. The text is really very distressing. You know, he never calls her a woman. He calls her a toy, a squirrel at one point, always a baby, a baby, a baby, a baby, a doll. There's never any humanizing of this character. And yet, oh, I love Act One. It's so romantic. And it's like, really? Is it? It's very seductive. It's very, it's very compelling. It's very, I think it's also very problematic, and as a director, and certainly as a woman, you can't just look the other way. You have to do both. You have to deliver on the music, and you have to deliver on the actual politics of what's happening.
Yeah, no, totally.
So I have a question for the panel. I mean, you look at the ethnic exoticism of Turandot and Madame Butterfly, and you say, along to that problem that you're mentioning, Lindy, there is also the problem of this appropriation of a culture, of putting it up in a way that is in many ways stereotypical. I mean, the whole notion of Chinese stereotypes are rife through Turandot. I mean, that's something that you just kind of go, oh my goodness, this is really. Now, does Aida fall into that same bracket? Is Verdi able to avoid that trap? Or does he fall into the same trap of ethnic exoticism, which is another form of appropriation? Or is there something different about that work to, say, Turandot and Madame Butterfly?
Aida is an interesting example because, you know, if you look at Aida, fundamentally, it's about Italy. Let's be honest. It's not about. It's about Italy. It's about empire in Italy. Yeah. But what was quite interesting was when the idea of sort of academic research into prehistory was very new. And Verdi really wasn't interested in that, the commission. His heart really wasn't in it, but he became fascinated once he discovered this new concept of actually making a sort of historical authenticity. And so, you know, when I hear people say, oh, you know, oh, it's not traditional, or it's not, you know, narrative. The 19th century had no sense of what things looked like. If you see, you know, engravings of Verdi's Macbeth, I mean, it's, you know, it's kind of any old costume they had. But actually, Aida was a turning point where an element of authenticity of depicted on stage actually did fascinate him, but he didn't really respond musically to it. I mean, he gave, you know, he gave martial music, which could accompany quite happily a 19th century army as much as a conquering army of Egyptians. So I don't think, although he did become fascinated in it, I've never really viewed, I've viewed Aida as a piece about Italian triumphalism, really.
And musically, it doesn't pretend to do anything other than Verdian music, you know,
Yeah,
where
that's right.
I think Puccini is guilty of appropriation music. I mean, the
Yes.
final gesture of the opera is an appalling pentatonic imitation of a Japanese tune, you know,
That's it.
and that's the great drama moment.
That's it.
Yes.
I mean, and what was interesting for us when we were approaching Porgy and Bess was the similar thing. Here you have Gershwin, Jewish white man, writing a story of Catfish Row. What are the stereotypes involved in that? Yes, he was basing it on a book, but hello. And so we as a company said, right, we're not going to go Catfish Row. Let's set the whole show in Soweto. We got a black company that 60% of them come from Soweto. Let's just make it set in Soweto. Let's issue all of those issues around Catfish Row. And again, is it African-American exoticism? And let's actually reset it in Soweto. There were some problems, you know. I'm on my way to New York. Well, New York's a hell of a long way from Soweto. You know, and Porgy on his little pram moving away across the plains of the savannah to get a steamboat to New York. That's a hell of a journey. But I mean, that's how we solved that problem, and it was successful. People bought into it.
You raised a little point earlier about you know, the composer. Of course, a composer belongs in his time, and he's viewing the piece. So, how important is it today to even consider the context or the views of composer? I mean, I will say to people, you know, when you read a book, you imagine it. You don't, you know, I was an English literature student, so yeah, we did look at what the writer's intention was, but that was not part of my creative response to a novel. So we in opera seemed a bit fixated on this idea that we have to do what the composer intended. One of you said that. So how important is that really? I'm not sure
it's always about what the composer intended, but I think it's about the response to the music. You know, you have to, as an opera director, you have to respond to the music. You have to. I've always loved saying what I do as a director is I help people listen with their eyes. You know, really kind of get inside the piece through the visual experience of it as well as the oral. But there are problems with that because music is so fixed in itself. You know, it is, you can conduct it and play it and think about it differently, but there's a certain element that is fixed, unlike a play. You know, we can go back again and again and again to Shakespeare and rethink it and reinterpret it and put different people and different genders in different characters and rethink it and put the emphasis somewhere else. But in the opera world, the emphasis is always fairly securely placed by the composer. That's both its joy and its fault. I was listening to Jacqueline Wilson, the children's writer, this morning, talking about a new book, which is an adaptation of an absolute classic, The Railway Children. Oh, well, why would you touch that? And as soon as she started explaining, you know, all the anachronisms that are in that book now for a young audience reading now, you think, well, of course it's got to change. So a really provocative question coming from someone whose life has been dedicated to making new work is, can we rethink the old works? Is there a way to dismantle some of this music hierarchy? Much as we might love it, you know, if it's saying the wrong things, can we dismantle them in some way? Can we rethink them? Can we not recompose them perhaps, but reconfigure them? Can we edit? And it's been done before.
Well,
so
I mean, yeah, I mean, with Shakespeare, Michael, it's a very brave director that's going to take a scalpel to Hamlet, isn't it?
Well, I'm not talking about scalpel to Hamlet, but I'm talking about scalpel to, well, Turandot.
Yes.
And that's what I'm talking about. I mean, to Hamlet, you can say how you want.
It was so interesting with the Berio ending in Turandot. I mean, there is a classic example where it's sort of become acceptable, the Berio ending. You see a lot of Turandots that have taken on that, and you've got that ending at the end of Turandot, and it's becoming more and more acceptable. That's the kind of thing you're talking about, Michael. That somebody said, let's finish the opera.
It is, but it's also about changing voices. You know, do we have to watch so many women murdered and committing suicide and dying on stage to satisfy the opera appetite? You know, are there different ways of thinking about that? We're always stuck with the voice.
Thinking of that. There are different ways of thinking of that, so that you're not just, I mean, particularly the violence against women. I guess this is what we're trying to approach a bit with Butterfly. We haven't changed the ending. She still kills herself at the end. But what we have noticed this time around, I hope, if we get it right, is that there have been red flags from the beginning of this opera all the way through to say that this girl is going to top herself. She's not emotionally capable of dealing with this. She says again and again, I would rather die. I'm going to die. I'm going to kill myself. And from Act 1 right through, her prized possession is the weapon of suicide. And she has the parental example of the escape, and every single time that we see somebody come into her life, no one helps her. Everyone sees what the problem is, and they fail her again and again. Now, I don't think I've ever seen a production of Butterfly where we are so aware of how ineffectual Sharpless is, and that people are just, and it's not to say we change the ending, but we do empathize more with the situation of those two women, I hope. I also think that you can look at works like Carmen, or some of those really problematic works. I don't speak for Turandot. I don't, but to look at those works from a different perspective that at least allows you to unpack some of the frustrations that those women are experiencing, instead of just taking it as, oh, well, this is the bit where she gets thrown to the ground, or this is the bit where someone slaps her across the face, or this is the bit where she jumps off, that there's a psychology around it that people can look, and audiences will go, oh my God, that is happening in this opera, rather than, isn't she a tragic heroine, or isn't she selfless, or poor little thing, I think it's about standing up for these women and giving them a voice within the constraints of these works.
One thing I'm always curious about, I know I've said this in public in our forums before, that you'd be surprised what a small percentage of our audience are what you might call the committed opera goer, who go to all our operas. People. I asked this question of Denny, Sayers, our choreographer, and I said, how many of our audience do you think see all our pieces? She thought, oh, maybe 65%. I said, Denny, it's probably around 5%. So 70% of our audience will come once a year, once every 2 years. So we have a casual audience, and that is our core audience. So it seems to me we can't assume that anyone who comes into our opera is going to know the piece, and we can't assume that they're going to come in with the expectation of a piece which satisfies those who have seen and loved Butterfly, or whatever it is, Carmen, or whatever, so many times. So it seems to me we're at a really interesting point where the majority of our audience don't expect the traditional trappings because they've never seen the piece, and will accept what is given to them as being what that piece is today.
Well, it is fantastic to look at these works through those eyes. I mean, talking about regional audiences, I remember taking a production of Rigoletto out to remote regional Australia, and the horror that people were talking about in the foyers afterwards, that this woman was put in a sack, and that her father had in effect murdered her. It was just like they were traumatized. You forget, it's like, this work is heartbreaking, and yet we all just, and then she goes into the sack, and then it's ghastly.
Lindy, I really like what you're saying about reframing it, and it struck me that if we accept that the opera that we put on, which is the 5 top operas in the world, are historical artifacts, I've been so interested in looking at how statues have been removed because they are offensive, and there's this real trauma, and particularly Rhodes, John Rhodes, etc. And I was so intrigued with that sort of iconic image of the bull in Wall Street, which is a sort of epitome of male testosterone. And suddenly, when this very clever artist came and put a young girl facing down the bull with her hands on her hips, suddenly reframed that whole moment of what that bull was, and has now been changed and subverted by the presence of that little girl. We should be doing that to opera. We should be finding ways where we are putting this up against something else, Aidan.
I think that's right, but I think there's an element there with the sculpture, which is that you can add to it.
Yes, that's it.
Creating an additional element to that sculpture,
yes.
In a way that I think that sometimes some of these operas, to be able to go forward, we need to not just reinterpret the interpretation of them.
That's it.
Yes.
because the music is so extraordinarily powerful. I think Così is a really interesting example. It's a profoundly misogynist premise. You're setting out to prove to these men that these women are fickle, which is just, it's unpalatable. And yet, when you listen to the music is telling you something else, because I hear that music as very profound, as very sincere music, where the men and the women are utterly caught up in the emotional worlds in which they find themselves, and the emergence of new feeling through that music. So if it wasn't for the misogynist plot, it would be heavenly. So there's a really interesting sort of dichotomy there. And
there are some composers who deal with this stuff more richly. I think Mozart, of course. I mean, even Don Giovanni, which I just absolutely love. Don Giovanni is such, every single character there. You've got this incredible kind of compelling sociopath driving it, but he's also funny, and he's evil and yet wonderful. I mean, I just love Don Giovanni, but the characters of the women in Mozart operas are just fantastic. They're so well drawn, and they're so complex, and they're so, no matter how much they're suffering on one side, there's also this kind of power of they're so intelligent. And I find also in Baroque opera, possibly because of the da capo aria form, you get a lot more room to flesh out considerations. I mean, I guess the ABA form too, you get a lot of opportunity to look at multiple sides of personalities and situations, and the complexity of things. I think that the notion of complexity within all of these characters and all of these relationships is better served by some composers than others. I would put Puccini in the others category in this case. There's not a lot of complexity to, say, Pinkerton, for example.
On the women front, I had a really interesting experience. A couple of years ago, I was able to direct with Music Theatre Wales a piece called Passion by Pascal Dussapin. And his approach to that, essentially it's the Orpheus and Eurydice story, but his approach to that was to say, let's look at this from her perspective. If you think about Monteverdi, Gluck, it all happens to him. You know, he's the one who has all the feelings about what's happened to him. Oh, woe is me, onwards. And if you think about it from her perspective, what's her agency, giving this woman agency? You know, and I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And I think that there, again, on an ethnic front, but certainly on a female front, there's looking about how one gives these characters agency and how much one has to struggle with the, you know, the 19th century sense of female agency, which so many of these works kind of control.
You know, Michael, we've just done Dido's Ghost, where Erilyn Wallen took very seriously the notion of restructuring, not rewriting Purcell, but certainly engaging with Purcell's complete opera and looking at as a woman, a Black woman, taking on this work and creating something rather interesting about it. And the choices that she made were absolutely fascinating. It made for a riveting evening, particularly the fact that she gave Dido's Lament, God forbid, to a man to sing. And it was fascinating to see that. And there's the challenge, you know. I mean, she took that sacred piece of Purcell and said, I'm going to create something in and around and with it. So her music intersected. Her music started, came to the end, intersected. I'm waiting for somebody brave enough to do that with a 19th century piece. Come on, somebody out there. Isn't that true, Aidan?
Well, this is right. And
would you commission a piece like that, Aidan? I'm putting you on the spot now.
Of course I will, Michael. I'll do it in co-production with the Buxton International Festival.
Let's choose the most popular, the top 5, and restructure. What would that be? It could be Turandot. That would be fascinating.
Very good. You know, I was thinking how, if you really strip any drama down to its basics, it's a series of conflicts, it's a series of engagements. A storyline fundamentally is of a number of people coming together, and at the end of it, we, the audience, make a judgment, and no two audience members will ever make the same judgment about that. And the opera problem is, especially something like with Puccini, where he is prescriptive, is that some people, some audiences, I think, struggle with the idea of having a different point of view, a different conclusion. Michael, to your point about, you know, there is really no absolute meaning to music, but it's given music by context. So how important, really, if it's important at all, is that context? Or if we really strip any opera down to its basics and then rebuild it, can we make a new work that way, to reimagining it?
Okay, so Lindy, I mean, you're so involved with Butterfly. I mean, I think the reason why I love Butterfly so much is that there is something very real about the relationship between Suzuki and her, and that there's a reality there that you kind of believe. You know, so, you know, and there's something so unique about that. And isn't it ultimately that the great works, it's because of those personal relationships that the composers have been able to sow into our souls, as it were, has been very believable. And maybe that's really what we should be focusing on, Aidan, when it comes to what you were saying.
I think, and as Aidan knows, one of my great passions, and maybe it's become a bit of a signature of what I do, is I love kind of bypassing the main roles and going to the secondary roles and just seeing what we can do there and what those roles are telling us about the world. Certainly pieces like Rigoletto are, you know, so much juicier when you kind of
Lindy's Giovanni in Rigoletto is one of the main characters. It's brilliantly done.
Well, it's true, and in Barbara of Seville, it's always about Berta and Ambrogio.
And Ambrogio, yeah.
Love story of Berta and Ambrogio, so they get it on.
Takes over.
It's really
fantastic, yeah.
But you're absolutely right, and again, it's just this really strange thing. It's like the thing of, you know, the notion of reimagining that is the premise of this conversation is partly about that. It's partly about what is it that about these works. And to me, I've just had the great privilege of doing this piece, and prior to that, The Marriage of Figaro in New Zealand, in Aidan's old company, and in both those works, the idea of something that is incredibly important to me personally, female friendship, is so richly presented. I mean, actually, the great love story of Butterfly is between Suzuki and Butterfly.
Absolutely.
She's there from the beginning to the
Absolutely.
end. She never looks away. She she holds her until the very last minute, and then she takes that child away to play. And she does everything she can to save that girl. And the same thing, I mean, when I was doing Marriage of Figaro, and the duet between Susanna and the Countess, the idea of that duet of these two women knowing that one is sending the other out to make love, or to be open to an affair with her husband. I mean, it just breaks my heart. And so as a woman, I know that I'm going to connect with those women in the audience. I know I am, when two women are clutching to each other, and that sort of, those sorts of things, and those smaller roles that you can start to really get the juice out of. So I guess that's a slightly hierarchical reimagining, if you like, of what it is really about the piece that is somehow has more to offer than just the main line of it's about this person and this hero and this heroine, to look at all the stuff underneath. But I think context, the question, Aidan, about context is it really has to, at the end of the day, it really has to relate to the world around us. We have to make works that sit in the context of our world, and that is the most important piece of context. Does it matter? Does it matter?
I think that's really important, and and it's a dangerous art form we're dealing with, because it does have a powerful impact on people, mentally, emotionally, sometimes physically. It really affects people. So I think it's a huge responsibility, if we're working in opera, to make sure that it is speaking in a way that isn't just diverting, or indeed suggesting things that don't sit well in today's world, and that's a big responsibility. The Mozart thing is extraordinary, because we just keep going back to it, that amazing genius for creating enriching character through music. I mean, it's all there in the music.
And I'd chip in Da Ponte as well, because Da Ponte has a sense of ambiguity and nuance and depth and multi-layers, which very few librettists have. And Mozart completely chimes in with that musically. I always think one of the great regrets about Così fan tutte, to come back to that, is that Mozart didn't allow its original title, which was The School for Lovers, because actually I think you then understand that all four of them, are on this extraordinary journey of discovery. So there's a layer but also that's an interesting piece, because the 19th century couldn't deal with it. So pieces go in and out of fashion and are perceived differently, and revived in Gleiborn in the 30s, and now it's perceived differently again. And it seems to me it behoves us practitioners to make sure that we are in tune with what society is saying today, and then tailor chime in with those perceptions in the way we present pieces, which is really what reimagining is about, rather than the 20 years ago the German conceptualization approach, which has run its course. And for me, we're in a world where a very rich and interesting new approach to opera has potential, ironically, precisely because suddenly people are audience members or potential audience members are raising very pertinent questions about the content of these pieces.
Michael talked earlier about opera is not realism, but one of opera's joys is it's almost more real. It gets so inside you that it's hard to escape. You can't help it. That it doesn't matter what it looks like; it's how it feels.
Totally. I mean, one of the questions, and for all us practitioners, is how do we bring along those audience members who may you know, have a very long-standing and valid relationship with our art form, how do we bring them along on a journey which says there is always another way of looking at a piece? It doesn't invalidate what you've found in yourself, but we are open to other ideas. I mean, Michael, are you finding with your audiences in Buxton a certain, you know, adventurousness? Or
well, yeah, I think, you know, to go back to Lindy in terms of what you were saying, Lindy, about revealing truths that are innately truthful in the text. And if you bring that to light as a director, your sophisticated long-term opera goer will appreciate that, even if it is different from what they've seen before. And it gives them lots to talk about. I find our Buxton audiences are very erudite, very knowledgeable, because they like the rare operas, of course. So they like to see these works that are not often performed, and that's what's the joy of doing Buxton, because they wanting something fresh, they wanting something different, something new. So they are a lot more adventurous than perhaps other places, because of the nature of what the festival is. So we have a duty of care to keep that going and make sure that we can continually be presenting opera in new ways that they'll appreciate.
Lindy, do you find these conversations are happening, you know, when you were working in Germany or in Stockholm recently, or in America? Are these conversations happening elsewhere, or are they unique? Well, I know they're in America because I was there as well with you. But what about in Europe, in Sweden and Leipzig, where you worked recently?
Oh, well, in Sweden, in Stockholm, when we did Cenerentola there, you know, it was a fantastic opportunity to do what is always seemed to be this sort of, you know, fun, light-hearted piece of gorgeous Rossini, and I adore it. But I mean, the conversation that they picked up on was the conversation about domestic violence, and that was an interesting thing, because it was the same. It was I think it was the day we opened, or the night we opened, was the International Women's Day, or not International Women's Day, but some day where they were talking about a day of awareness of domestic violence, and the intendantin came in, gave the speech, and talked about this work in that context before the opening night. And I thought, wow, that's really gutsy, and thank you. It was wonderful to have that. So that was an interesting thing. So that conversation happened. And then I have to say, I mean, as you know, I mean, I've had more conversations in the last, I guess, 3 years about the political context in which pieces like, in our case, Rigoletto in Seattle sits, and Seattle, that production is now going off to Opera Philadelphia, because they want to have the political conversation. Certainly when I was directing, the most recent thing was the Marriage of Figaro in New Zealand, and that was a conversation very much about feminism, very much about seeing the piece through a feminist perspective. We had an all-female creative team, from my, you know, director, designer, conductor, and it was definitely through the Martha Nussbaum perspective on the Marriage of Figaro. And so there was there is conversation going. Yes, definitely.
Definitely. And to add to Lindy, there was a degree in South Africa where everybody wanted the death penalty to come back, and I was like, let's do Dead Man Walking. Let's get Jack Hagee's piece down here. Let's have a whole discussion around the death penalty, and let's put the piece on. And everybody was like, Michael, what are you doing? Dead Man Walking came down. We had discussions. We had some very heated talks about the death penalty, and it can be used as a really interesting springboard, isn't it?
Well, I think the theatre is that, and the opera is part of that world. You know, it's not a place of comfort. It's a place of challenge and thought and provocation and discussion and development. You know, it's a public discussion, isn't it? And if it's not that, we're doing it a disservice.
Yeah, or just wussing out. I mean, I think we have the great privilege of doing these works, and if we don't do them, just to do them mindlessly is not to do them justice at all.
Agreed.
One of the panelists 2 days ago rather brilliantly put it about, you know, joining the dots for our audiences, really what we want them to leave the theatre and actually join the dots to life today. And that's really where we make that that connection with art. And it's not politics, it's society, it's art and the world we live in.
Around us, absolutely.
Yes.
Our
Yes.
time.
And opera has, you know, in its intense humanity of the characters at the best, you know, when it's at its best, it just has that ability to combine its power with the power of message and make it overwhelming if done well. I mean, I'll make Lindy blush, but the Rigoletto, which she referred to, which we did, well, she did together with me. I can't say it was mine. It was Lindy's in New Zealand, and I remember it's a similar thing in advance, that there was worries that it was set in, it was kind of inspired by Silvio Berlusconi, and afterwards. Not only did I not get a single letter saying, "Dear Mr. Lang, it was modern," but on the contrary, I got letters and people come up to me to say, you know, I have never understood that piece before because I found a connection with life rather than it hiding behind something of a veil of costume, of period, etc. By bringing it forward. You know, some very one gentleman who was, you know, a great traditionalist. He said, "I'm normally a traditionalist." I said, "Alfie, you are a decadent modernist now. You've passed your test." You know, but you know, it was that it really proved that if done with scrupulous attention to truth, that people will respond.
But I would also say, Aidan, you know, at the end of the day, we're in show business, seriously, and we have to make productions that appeal and that are you know, that are compelling theatre and compelling storytelling. So I think one of the things that we must do while we're doing all this stuff is deliver on the moments, the great moments of these works. And I mean, I have been very, you know, grateful for the casting in this Welsh National Opera Butterfly and for Carlo Rizzi in the Pit, because, you know, the music, the monumental music moments will be 100% delivered on. And as a director, I think one of the tricky things is not to suck the joy out of these works. I mean, people come because they want to feel and my, you know, that's the I guess the challenge is finding ways to meet the moment that it might not be the way they've expected the moment, but they will get that moment anyway. I hope, touch wood, that we've found some big moments, because there are big moments and we want to deliver those big moments, you know.
Final question. Do we think the future in a time where everyone's telling us our art form is difficult, is actually bright if we have the courage to take the art form in a new direction?
Yes, I think we have to. I mean, that's what I live my life for. And you know, trying to give these war horses the agency of a contemporary voice is really, really hard. You know, and I just say, well, you know, just let's develop the new repertoire. Let's develop the new work that you know, maybe in 100 years' time, it doesn't matter if they're performed or not, because they've got to speak to us now in some way. I find that eternally fascinating. And, you know, opera has this kind of burden of history upon it, which is you write the thing and then it might not be understood now or traditionally, but it'll be understood in a while. Let's make it speak now. And let's make it a little more fluid, a little more flexible, a little more, you know, it's complex, it's expensive and all of that, yes. But for me, it's one of the fundamental forms of human expression and entertainment, you know, music and song. What gets more basic than that?
My answer is very straightforward. Bring on the next generation. They're dying to get their teeth into it.
Totally. Lindy will give you a final word.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, thanks, Aidan. Yeah, no, I would I concur with my fellows here. I think open the doors, open them wide, and as many voices as possible, as diverse voices as possible. And yes, there'll be change, there'll be turbulence, there'll be some people who'll drop off, there'll be lots of people will gather along. It's like a, you know, think of opera as like a festival. You know, you have to reinvent and reinvent and reinvent. Otherwise, you're not doing your job.
Well, we've reached our term. Lindy, Michael, thank you so much for just the hour has flown past. I feel we could probably go on for another hour quite happily. Ladies and gentlemen, we have our third of our panel discussions next Tuesday, same time, 7 o'clock. This is one looking at an element of Butterfly, which actually really we're not embracing this production, but it was very central to Joachim Hertz's production, which was with us for 43 years. The discussion is called The Long Arm of Imperialism. And as I say, although that Lindy's production is sort of emphasizing other areas of the work, nonetheless, it's very pertinent to the way this piece is perceived by many people in our community. So if you're interested to join in that webinar, to come and see it, please do. Same procedure, you book on and join us. Everyone on the panel, thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for spending time with us. And we look forward to seeing you at Madame Butterfly. It opens next Friday. Take care now. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.